All right, welcome back, constant listener. This is Nick Diolius. We are now on, I think, episode 6, I want to say, of our Far Middle podcast, where we're discussing concepts that are expanded upon in my upcoming book, The Leech. And today we want to spend some time talking about what I think is the most crucial chapter in the entire book, and that is the issue of STEM education, particularly how STEM education has become the target of the Leech with respect to where it's turning its attention to. Now, STEM, of course, stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. I will admit up front, I am a huge supporter and advocate of STEM education. I've benefited from it personally from a career perspective, but I think society today, there's a little doubt that it relies on STEM education and STEM prowess more than at any other time in our history of mankind or the United States or anything in between those two. And its prominence, the prominence of STEM is only going to grow in society as time goes on. This is not a trend that's going to stop anytime soon. And I think, too, that when you look at STEM education, this realization of its importance in a society or in a nation's strategic positioning, that is not lost upon by any stretch of the imagination with respect to our rivals. If you look at China in particular, they completely understand the importance of STEM, and they do everything they can to further nurture, grow, and improve their performance in those arenas. U.S. News and World Report, they like to rank top universities across the globe, not just within the United States. When you look at top engineering universities that are across the globe from a U.S. News and World Report perspective, 3 of the top 10 universities are Chinese universities when it comes to engineering talent. When you look at U.S. universities, 2 in the top 10. So right now, China has more universities ranked in the top 10 for engineering globally than the United States does. I think worse yet, when you look at the number of STEM graduates in China versus the United States, it's somewhere approaching a 10-to-1 margin. I think it's around an 8-to-1 margin currently. So 8 times as many Chinese STEM graduates annually in the university system in China than in the United States. And if you just look at the pace that China is creating and opening new universities, it's sort of mind-boggling. I want to say it's around 2,000 new universities in 15 years that have been opened in China. And a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of those 2,000 universities, of course, were really focusing and specializing in technical fields. You look at math proficiency, which is a great proxy for STEM education and where the state of STEM is within a nation. On math proficiency for 15-year-olds, China at the top of the global list, United States is somewhere in the bottom half. So you can look at this under a couple of different metrics, all of which point to the same thing, which is China and the Chinese are doing everything they can to double down, triple down on their STEM aptitude. And when you compare that and stack that up against where the United States is situated, you get some troubling comparisons and some troubling contrasts. This contrasting of China and the U.S. when it comes to STEM education, STEM fields, technology, it goes beyond the statistics that I just quoted. You see it also with respect to the geopolitical stage and industrial espionage. What I'm talking and referencing particularly here is the Chinese 1,000 Talents program, which recruits and convinces professors, researchers in the United States, throughout the developed world, the Western world, to either visit China and lecture or share research or some combination of those two things. And the official purpose of the program is to celebrate innovation and elevate Chinese competitiveness, those types of things. But when you look at what the essence of it is, the essence of the 1,000 Talents program, it is blatant industrial espionage. There's no other way of putting it. And trying to procure, snatch technology that others have been developing, and then obviously bring that within the fold of what China and the Chinese Communist Party are able to bring to bear. Now, I've said in the past and gone on record saying that when you look at the 1,000 Talents program and you look at all the incidents now that have arisen, where professors at some of our most well-renowned universities have been found to be taking money, basically bribes, to procure and provide industrial espionage to the Chinese, where you don't find the 1,000 Talents program focus upon or poaching with respect to are professors that are in the social sciences or in the humanities, arts, music, philosophy, government, religious studies, those arenas. And sometimes people hear me say that and they think that I'm denigrating or making light of those areas of study. It's not the case. The simple fact of the matter is those areas are not STEM-centric. And thus, when it comes to strategic competitiveness, at least as far as the Chinese are concerned, aren't as useful with respect to areas that are STEM-focused when it comes to procuring industrial know-how and technology under the 1,000 Talents program. So while the Chinese clearly get it when it comes to the importance of STEM, and they're doing everything in their power, ethically or unethically, to increase and improve their competitive position relative to us, what are we doing? Unfortunately, we're often doing the exact opposite. We're consciously, at least with respect to our higher education system, watering down, diluting STEM education, and trying continually to convert it into that acronym that you saw, possibly STEAM, STEAM, instead of STEM, where it's the same science, technology, engineering, and math, but now it's got an A in there in the form of arts. And this, of course, is represented by the interest of the humanities. So when it comes to the humanities, just to be clear of my view on that, the humanities, proud legacy, great history. I'm a fan of the humanities. I love literature. I'm a supporter of the arts. I like music. So when it comes to everything from history to art to music to literature, no doubt I'm a big supporter and fan of the humanities. However, the other fact of the matter is that the country and society cannot run on the humanities. So when you hit the light switch and you want there to be electricity, or when you want to fly cross country or drive somewhere, or when you need to develop a pharmaceutical or a cure for a disease with advanced medical techniques and science, those types of things, including the IT world and internet, those types of things rely exclusively on STEM ability. And the humanities or the arts are largely on the sideline with respect to those, despite their proud legacy and the role they play in society today. So it's not to diminish the arts or the humanities, but it's also to reflect the fact that if you start to dilute STEM, and particularly STEM education of students in colleges and universities with demanding and shoving more arts or humanities into the curriculum, a couple of things happen. First, there's only so many credit hours that a student has within a 4-year program. So that means that less attention, less instruction will occur in the technical fields that they're studying for, and that's going to inevitably produce graduates that are less steeped in those areas and less adept at those disciplines because they haven't had as much exposure to them. And two, you also see an interesting dynamic when it comes to funding and resources and budgeting, where the more A that you inject into STEM and convert it into STEAM, not only is there more time of the student that's allocated towards non-STEM areas of study, but perhaps more importantly, the administrative budget, the humanities budgets, the budgets of areas outside of STEM benefit, and they are subsidized largely with the resources that would have gone to or should have gone to perhaps STEM education, STEM faculty, STEM bricks and mortar. So there's certainly an aspect of what's occurring here with the dilution of STEM that has to do with the procurement of resources, being able to procure more budget, more staffing, more bricks and mortar for areas that are outside of STEM, using the need to convert STEM into STEAM as a convenient cover. And that is very consistent, as we discussed on a prior podcast, of one of the attributes of the Leech way. But there's also something much more sinister at work here, I believe, when it comes to STEM dilution. And that has to do with the need or the desire to suppress free thought and dissent within our higher education institutions. Throughout history, this has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Science, the scientific community, has always been that consistent protection against the resistance of tyranny, and particularly the tyranny of thought. When you go back to our prior podcast installment, we talked a lot about academia and how it's evolved from the marketplace of ideas and free expression to one that's very closed-minded and very oppressive ideologically. Well, when you become more oppressive to free thought, free speech, and you become very rigid ideologically, the scientific community, STEM fields become a big threat. So what better way to eradicate the greatest threat to the suppression of free thinking on campus than to fundamentally change and alter what STEM education is. And what happens, of course, and this is the sinister part of it, instead of science checking politics, which has always been the case historically when you had a strong scientific community and standing, now you've got a situation where politics is checking science. We're going to cover some examples where that's exactly what's occurring across campuses in the United States. Now, politics checking science, as it relates to STEM, one of the ways that that's done is demanding that political correctness, certain ideologies get injected into STEM education. And one of the favorite tactics of achieving that is to decry the humanities crisis. Many of us may have heard about the humanities crisis, but one of the problems you'll quickly run into or come to the realization of, certainly was true for me, how we think of the humanities, that's the way they were. That is not necessarily anything like the way they are today. So we think of humanities, and most of us come up with this view, this connotation of if you major in humanities, you're going to be spending 4 years really diving deep into English literature, art, philosophy, the classics, so to speak, right? Today, that is not the humanities. Today, a degree or pursuing a degree in humanities in many instances is going to run the risk of a immersion into ideological programming that's very focused, very surgical in what it's trying to achieve if you're a student, the recipient. And the curriculum of the humanities effort in our higher education system, it's been dramatically revamped by a very small portion, but a very influential portion of students and faculty. And what are they looking to do? They're looking now to inject that ideology and the politics into the humanities curriculum. And unfortunately, it's not just the humanities that have been subjected to this. You've also seen this happen now with the social sciences. And the social sciences, I don't care if you're talking about economics or sociology or any of the other disciplines that fall under the social sciences, I always thought of them in the middle of the spectrum, or the two bookends of the quantitative-qualitative spectrum. So on the quantitative spectrum, you had STEM education, and on the qualitative spectrum, you had the humanities, and in the middle, somewhere in the middle there, sat the social sciences acting as a bridge, which has always intrigued me about the social sciences. That's why I've always been interested in areas like economics or some of those other disciplines, because it's got a little bit of both, and it does help bridge that spectrum between humanities and STEM. But the days where the social sciences sat between that quantitative-qualitative spectrum with STEM and humanities on each end, they're long gone as well. And today, the humanities, in that small cadre of the drivers that have subsumed the humanities, they have then moved on to the social sciences. And the social sciences and the humanities today, in many instances, are effectively waging war on the STEM disciplines. Now, this conversion of the humanities and the social sciences and how they're waging war in many instances on STEM leads to some pretty strange outcomes. One example of this, you can obtain an English degree at many universities in the United States these days, and including some of the most elite universities in our nation, without taking a course in Shakespeare. Now, I'm not a big fan of Shakespeare. He's beyond me and my mental capacity to digest literature. But I would be surprised, at least personally, to learn that I could go obtain or earn an English degree at a elite university and not have to study Shakespeare. That's just an odd outcome. But it shows you some of the strange results or scenarios that are created with this dynamic. And when you listen to the advocates that are decrying the humanities crisis and the need to do something, how they define it and how they manufacture the crisis, it's always a little bit different, depends on who you're listening to or who's doing the speaking. But the one thing they all have in common is that there's a critical need from their perspective for more funding for the humanities. It could be faculty, whether it's tenured or teaching faculty. It could be more buildings dedicated to the humanities, more classes and coursework, more degrees. All of those things are needed to reinvest resources into the humanities to end this crisis. And the problem, of course, is that all of this more, right, that they're calling for has to come at the expense of something else, because the student has, again, only so many credit hours to earn a degree with respect to, and at least theoretically, right, can only spend so much on tuition. and the same with the university when it comes to its budget. And I say theoretically in the case of the university because sometimes it seems like there are no budgetary limits when it comes to universities, but nevertheless there are. So when you look at addressing the critical crisis in humanity, so to speak, it's going to have to come at the expense of something else. And unfortunately, that something else more and more is looking like STEM programs and STEM budgets. Now, one of the ways that the humanities or advocates that are decrying the humanities crisis try to procure additional resource is to not just put more A into STEM and convert it into STEAM, so to speak, but to make the argument that by doing so, you're creating better graduates in STEM. You're making them better team players, problem solvers. They got better communication skills. They got a better moral compass on ethics, those types of things. Now, again, that sounds good. Those attributes are certainly attributes that are in demand in the real world and the real economy. But the question really comes down to, or is the humanities department at a modern university or the social sciences disciplines at a modern day college campus, are those the best sources for things like team building, moral, ethical compass, et cetera? I would question that. In fact, in some instances, I would say that the last place on earth that, say, an engineer or a scientist should look for moral guidance in preparing for the competitive world is the humanities department across the quad. That's often not going to be the case. Now, of course, this sort of marketing of why you would want more A into STEM and STEAM is really driven by the rationale to allow the liberal arts and humanities across academia to avoid what should happen, which is reform and evolution. And in some instances, frankly, downsizing to match what the current world, the current economy demands. So whether it's history or literature or arts or religious studies or whatever the case might be across social sciences or humanities or the arts, the demand for those types of graduates today may indeed be significantly lower than what they were historically. But if the university system and its organization hasn't evolved with the changing times, you're going to need something to justify keeping staffing, faculty, budgets for those types of disciplines where they're at. And this attack on STEM that's occurring within our higher education system, it gets a lot of support, a lot of a boost everywhere else across society. So just think about kids and what kids are receiving as a message from parents and just culture and the rest of society on what you'd want to aspire to be. So, the star athlete and the star musical performer are the idols that kids are aspiring to and that, frankly, adults look up to and emulate as well. Whereas the scientist and the coder and the engineer, they're largely viewed as, if anything, social misfits or geeks in our society. Very different than what occurs in China or in India or in Russia with respect to those different professions. Just think about what we award. If you take a look at the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which I wrote about on my website, nickdeolius.com, under the commentary section if you want to give it a look, or of what gets awarded under, say, National Science Foundation grants, it's the types of things that, again, or the types of individuals and careers that are much more in the server category in the entertainment industry of athletics, of music, of film, and those types of arenas than what I would call the core STEM scientists, engineers, doctors that are looking for a cure, etc. And that is also disappointing. And then look at what society demands in terms of rigor and discipline when it comes to the readiness of students going about their higher education journey, which you often see, whether it's GPAs or standardized test scores or taking remedial courses to basically bone up on math or science deficiencies before you hit university. Instead of those things, you see them being dropped. So GPA and standardized test scores are now dropped. And what you see is an approach and a philosophy from our higher education system and wider society where it's viewed as being better to lower the standards and quality of the STEM degree than it is to provide the tools for maybe the ill-equipped student to get up to speed and to get to a proficiency level where it makes them competitive and successful in a STEM field. And the net culmination of all these things, all these messages and and all the reinforcement mechanisms before you get to college and after college and across wider society beyond the quad, the end result is that may have reached a time, and frankly, I think we're there, where whether an engineer that's being minted in China or a coder that's being minted in India or a researcher in the medical field that's coming out of whatever other area of the world, let's say Russia, they may be more competent today than a new American engineer or coder or medical researcher. And that is something that is both startling and very troubling. Another fascinating aspect about the headwinds that STEM is facing today is how inconsistent it is and opposite of what you see in the real world and in the market. What I mean by that is that the clamoring demand for STEM skill sets and disciplines has never been higher in the marketplace with employers than it is today. And today, I think we've reached a point, at least in my opinion, where it's much more important to look at what you majored in versus where you got your degree at. That wasn't always the case, but I think today that is absolutely true. You see that also with this decline in demand for degrees in the humanities and liberal arts. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences, that's one of the biggest advocates of the humanities. They themselves said that the role of humanities in the economic life of the United States may not be as readily apparent as that of engineering. And that's a true assessment. The data show this. PayScale is a firm that does a great job aggregating pay data across different job categories and disciplines, both early career pay and mid-career pay. Top 10 majors for them in mid-career pay the past couple of years. It's all kinds of engineering disciplines. Actuarial mathematics is in there. Also, the IT field is represented. It's the types of things that are just traditional STEM-heavy disciplines. And if you start going down that list, you don't come to what I would call a non-STEM humanities or social sciences major in the top 20. In fact, you don't get to one until it's, I think, 51st. And the first one to pop up, interestingly, is government, which brings up a whole different discussion consistent with our big government podcast a while back that we issued. And the other interesting comparison of humanities and liberal arts isn't necessarily in the data head-to-head with STEM, which is bad enough and very stark, but it's also seen in what many would call blue-collar jobs versus degrees in humanities and liberal arts. The blue-collar jobs, in many instances, do much better when it comes to compensation, and better yet, they're not saddled with a bunch of student debt that also fundamentally shifts and changes the economics for the worse when you look at rate of return for the student or the graduate or the worker. So whether it's a plumber or a mechanic or a farmer or a truck driver, they're doing quite well with regard to their careers and their compensation levels, and they're not being saddled with a bunch of college debt that's not going to have a rate of return tied to the end of it when it's all said and done. And then last but not least, I think everyday Americans, I think we figured this out. A recent poll showed that only 26% of adults with college experience strongly agreed that the education they received is relevant to their work and their life. And that's a pretty damning finding from the customer base, so to speak, of higher education. It should require some internal thought and self-reflection with respect to the business model. I doubt whether or not that's going to occur, however. And by the way, if you care about something like the role and the position of women in the workplace and the gender wage gap, which I certainly do for a lot of reasons, the issues that are facing STEM are not going to help that situation by any stretch of the imagination. And the reason really is borne out once again by the data and the statistics. If you look at just overall college enrollment, the college student body nationally is over 50% women, but only about a fifth of the graduates in STEM-heavy fields of engineering, computer science, only a fifth of those graduates are women. So we are not graduating a proportional share of women in STEM fields versus the overall graduates in college in total. And you look at the data and how compensation levels play out with regard to these different disciplines that we just discussed, you can quickly see how that gender wage gap becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a bad way, because we're graduating predominantly or disproportionately female students in the lower paying professions and not getting a good representation of female graduates in the higher paying STEM fields, where it's only a fifth, give or take. Now, if we could find a way of reinforcing, bolstering, reinvesting into STEM fields heavier and reflecting what the market is demanding, and then that could correlate with a shift in female students from these majors that are not as STEM heavy or not STEM focused into STEM disciplines, that would go a long way toward erasing the gender wage gap that we're currently experiencing in the country. And boy, wouldn't that be a wonderful objective to pursue. Now, of course, this issue of gender wage gap and the lack of female representation or female representation not being high enough in STEM fields, that is something that is often used as a convenient excuse to expand what is an already bloated administrative bureaucracy within colleges and universities. So if you take the example of engineering programs, and you can pick basically whatever engineering program you'd want across the country, inevitably you're going to come across bureaucrats that are on the staffing of the university programs or colleges, and they've got some title, dean of this or a chief equity officer or diversity, something like that, right? And they've got very noble missions with respect to what they're trying to achieve. But unfortunately, the reality is that few of these bureaucrats, they are meaningfully improving what I would call the state of STEM or female representation in STEM. And worse yet, if they're not accountable for driving tangible results in the positive direction when it comes to something like the gender wage gap or female representation in STEM, then what they're doing, because it's adding to the administrative bloat and bureaucracy, is that they are diluting resources net from STEM curricula and programs and facilities and faculty, which is not a good thing either. Now, the attacks on STEM within our higher educational institutions, they come about from different angles and different directions, and you can categorize a lot of these into certain buckets. One for sure is sustainability. Sustainability in many ways is taking on attributes of a religion at various campuses, and some reference it as the ultimate liberal art. And in many ways, depending on the situation you're assessing, it has become the ultimate liberal art. We go into a lot of detail and discussion of how sustainability can be used to attack STEM in the book with the STEM chapter, and I encourage you to give it a read. Another big category or bucket of how STEM falls under attack is under what constitutes and how different research pieces or papers are published across peer-reviewed journals. So the whole process of the publish or perish culture within academia, which has always existed. So there's a pressure to keep publishing research and work and papers in academically peer-reviewed journals. Then the process of that review, what the process demands to be able to get published, you come up with some really interesting examples of what constitutes science or what constitutes research or what comprises engineering when you start looking at some of these work products. So there's some examples, again, in the book, The Leech, in our STEM chapter, and you'd be shocked. I mean, you would read these and think at first blush that it was a bit of a joke or a hoax. And in most of those instances, it's anything but a hoax. This was actually what's being offered and proffered in academic peer-reviewed journals and across different STEM disciplines at different academic institutions as legitimate research, legitimate publications. So why is this all so crucial and epic and important? I said this was what I consider to be the most important subject or chapter in the entire book, The Leech. Well, we talked about how our rivals, China, they understand the importance of STEM to the extent they keep bolstering their effort and we don't do the same. They strategically become advantaged. We, by difference, become strategically disadvantaged. Of course, that's important. We talked about the individual and their career and how keeping STEM focused and STEM true to itself and not diluting it and attacking it helps with pay scale and career advancement and just overall path and life journey. And that's an important thing. We need more STEM focus, not less. More STEM grads, not less. But there's another component to this. And that component and its importance really speaks to our culture, government, and frankly, life or death situations is sort of manifested in itself recently in the arena of pandemic and COVID. So what do I mean by that? Well, culturally, if you want a society that is going to be advanced technologically and is STEM focused, you need a culture that is going to be very comfortable with disagreeability and dissent. And you're going to want a culture where individuals who challenge the scientific consensus, which I think is an oxymoron, the concept of scientific consensus. Science is not about consensus. Science is about breaking consensus and tearing down consensus, frankly. Galileo did not have consensus, neither did Columbus, and neither did any of the other great minds, including Einstein. But you want a culture that's comfortable with that. And in many ways, being a dissenter and being difficult or disagreeable, that is the driver of invention, of advancement. And if you've got social pressures and standards and that type of a culture, and it can be in the form of just what you're teaching in universities or the cancel culture that we hear so much about or speech codes, then that's going to stop and deter a lot of that type of a culture of dissent, challenging the consensus, disagreeability, and that is going to stunt the development of where we go technologically. When government comes on top, over the top with respect to this culture and reinforces it, that has a compounding exponential effect because government has all the purse strings and controls the purse strings that fund STEM and drives scientific innovation. Doesn't matter if it's the National Academy of Sciences or the National Science Foundation or government agencies that are huge funders of STEM and research like the Department of Energy. You add them all up, if they are politically correct in their thinking, ideologically rigid, demand scientific consensus adherence, and they're not inviting open debate and challenging the consensus, as I said, it's just going to compound the cultural impact and what we're seeing within academia and taking us to an even worse place. And I mentioned that you see this sort of dynamic within our higher education system and within government and within our culture generally manifest itself recently in the pandemic arena with COVID. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, right now that debate is raging out there about what the politically correct view of as the origins of COVID were not long ago, and now what the facts are saying now that more facts come out into the light for all to see. And it looks more and more like there was some shenanigans going on right within a Chinese lab and that there was a cover-up that ensued post the release of COVID upon the world. Now, what's disturbing about this is that on one hand, when you look at the Chinese Communist Party, you understand why that cover-up may have occurred or why it still continues today. It's an authoritative regime, and when you go against the grain in an authoritative regime, the consequences are going to be severe, immediate, and obvious and significant. So I get why that's been sort of the behavior that we saw coming from China and the Chinese Communist Party. But what about the behavior and actions that we saw within our own country and with respect to our own institutions? We spoke back on our first podcast about the failure of the expert class and how it's failed time and time again across a range of different arenas and predictions. Well, once again, we've seen the failure of the expert class. It doesn't matter if it was the government or the scientific community or the tech industry, specifically social media, the media itself, right? There was very much a groupthink that was applied there. And I'm sure there are individuals within those industries that thought differently or felt differently, but did they ever have a chance, frankly, against the groupthink that was employed on a vast scale compared to the individual? So I get why it happened in China, but the fact that it happened here and continues to some extent to happen today at the time of the taping of this podcast, where we've got a constitution, we've got a Bill of Rights, we've got a history and a legacy of academic sort of open thought and the marketplace of ideas, and we've got a proud legacy of scientific achievement and innovation. Why do we see that happen in this nation? And what does that say about the culture of academia, where government's head is at with respect to reinforcing it, and where we're heading as a culture when it comes to STEM? Certainly food for thought. This wraps up our current installment of the Far Middle Podcast. I want to thank you for once again tuning in and being a constant listener. And we will be in touch again to talk about another exciting subject in the near future.